Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Press Club. We are delighted to have so many of you in the room with us for the book event. Our formal program will begin in just about 60 seconds. Before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to review some housekeeping items. We are recording tonight, so we would appreciate if you could silence your cell phones to avoid disrupting that broadcast. And we love to hear from all of you and get your questions. If you have any questions of our guests today, if it's more convenient to email your questions, please do so to headliners@press.org, or you'll find little cards on your seats if you'd like to write out a question and then hand your card over to our staff person. Cecily is right there, and she'll take the card and then send it on my way, and we'll go from there. Oh my gosh. I wish my house worked that well. Everybody got quiet and tuned right in. I guess we'll just jump right in. Good evening. I'm Elisa Parenti, and for the last 10 plus years, I've been a journalist at Bloomberg News. I'm the vice president of the National Press Club, and it's my honor to welcome you to the National Press Club. It is the place where news happens. Thank you for joining us for our headliner book event with Eliza Reid. She is the author of Death on the Island. We are happy to accept your questions, as I mentioned, and as time permits, we'll make sure to get every last one of them. Eliza Reid's debut novel opens with a gaggle of diplomats, a raging storm, a flaming drink, which, by the way, they are making here, back there. If you haven't had an opportunity, that is a brand-on experience there. And a mysterious death on the island, Iceland's remote, sparsely populated Westman Island. This particular setting makes total sense when we consider the path that its author took on her way to her first work of fiction. Eliza Reid began life as a Canadian. After finishing her degree at University of Toronto, she went on to Oxford University in England to pursue her master's degree in modern history. At a party one night, she met a fellow history student, Gudni Johannesson, an Icelander. A love story ensued. A move to Iceland followed. In Iceland, where everyone uses first names, which is particularly convenient for me, as I might have some trouble pronouncing some of them, Eliza co-founds the Iceland Writers' Retreat, gives birth to 4 children, and becomes First Lady when her husband is elected president of Iceland in 2016. It was a busy time. In 2020, in her own attempt to puzzle out the mysteries of Icelandic society, we get her first book, a bestseller, Secrets of Sprakar, Iceland's Extraordinary Women and How They Are Changing the World. That book explores the country's particular penchant for gender equality through interviews with a wide range of extraordinary yet ordinary women. So we are thrilled to welcome Eliza Reid to talk about her first work of fiction, Death on the Island. Let's welcome her up. Fancy entrance. And before we dive right in, we also have another very special guest joining us, and I'd like to recognize, if you could please stand, the ambassador of Iceland to the United States, Svanhildur. She previously served as Secretary General of the Iceland Chamber of Commerce, Senior Advisor at the Prime Minister's Office. We are quite honored to have you here with us this evening. Thank you. So let's get this party started. Eliza, thank you so much for your work and for what you've done. This is extraordinary, and I'm so excited to hear how did this whole story come about? And you said truth is stranger than fiction, right?
Truth is stranger than fiction. I don't know if you want the long version or the short version, but I want to start by thanking you very much for having this interview today, and to Cecily, who has disappeared somewhere, and Donna for hosting this event here in these storied walls. What a wonderful privilege to be able to host the DC event here. And you know what, one of my first jobs, maybe my second job once I got to Iceland, was as a journalist, and I'm still a proud member of the Journalists Union of Iceland. So this is extra important too. And yeah, as I said, the truth is stranger than fiction, and I think that I'll try to give you the potted version that is a little bit beyond just writing my first novel, if you'll indulge me for a moment, and you have to because you came to hear me talk about books. So, I actually studied international relations at university, which was my undergraduate degree. And of course, many people who study international relations go on to serve in their nation's diplomatic services, and I have great admiration for that. But I grew up in Ottawa, Canada, and to me, it was incredibly dull to think of returning to my hometown if I wanted to go and work. And of course, that opinion changes as you get a little bit older and realize that one's hometown is actually quite nice and very pleasant. But my life led me in a different direction, and I did a master's degree at Oxford University, and there were a great many Canadians studying at Oxford, as you can imagine, great many Americans, great many Germans, one man from Iceland. And that man from Iceland created my entire stereotype of what these people were like, because I'd never met anyone from that country before. And he was a very funny, smart, but quite quiet man. And one evening, you're really getting a slightly longer story, if you'll forgive me. There was a raffle to fundraise for the rowing crew at the college. And we thought it was very Oxford to row, even though we weren't any good. And the fundraiser worked that people would buy these paper tickets that they put their names on and put them in these like cups that the people on the rowing crew had, and they would draw a name and have to take the person on a date. And my husband was one of the people, my now husband was one of the people who had his name in one of these cups. And I had a 2-pound coin, and actually one of my dear friends from that day is here tonight, so she was at this party and can verify how true it was. And I remember thinking, what the heck, I'm gonna buy the 10 tickets for 2 pounds. And I thought this man was quite interesting and funny and smart, and I thought, this is my carpe diem moment. And I put 8 of those tickets in his cup. And I thought, I don't want to put them all in, because if somebody finds out I'm like some sort of stalker. But this is going to nudge things, and make it happen. And so inevitably, he drew my name to go out for dinner. And the next night, he took me for a really nice 3-course Italian dinner with a bottle of red wine, which I felt very extravagant because I was a student. And also, I remember thinking, now, does he like me, or are all Icelanders like this? Again, I didn't know. But that was the beginning of a beautiful romance, and we fell in love. We moved to Iceland in 2003. I started working first for a company, and then later fell into journalism. Used to edit Icelandair's in-flight magazine. Founded an event called the Iceland Writers Retreat with my dear friend Erica Green, who's also here tonight. It's nice to have old friends in the house. And Goodney and I got married, and we had 4 children together in just under 6 years. Also not that unusual in Iceland, but maybe in other places. And as you can imagine, when you both work full time and you have 4 kids, and I have a stepdaughter as well, that life can get a little bit hectic, but very fun. And in 2016, our kids were 2, 4, 6, and 8. He had just got tenure at the University of Iceland as a historian, his sort of professional pinnacle, or so he thought. And the Panama Papers scandal broke at the beginning of April that year, which I think many of you who work in this world will remember. And in Iceland, we have a president and a prime minister. President is sort of more of a unifying figure, the head of state, prime minister, head of government. And my husband was the pundit who was called on television to analyze the crisis, because there was a lot of protests demanding that the prime minister resign. He was writing a book on the presidents of Iceland at the time. And there was an ongoing presidential election. This is in April. The presidential election was scheduled for June that year. The outgoing president had said he wasn't going to run again, and nobody had really captured the public's imagination. And as I recall it vaguely, but it's all kind of a haze, because kids, 2, 4, 6, 8, full-time job, etc. I'm at home, he's been on TV all day, and somebody calls our landline, which nobody ever did, even in those days, and says, is Goodney home? And I said, no. And he said, well, my name is such and such, and I live in this old age home in this town, Patreksfjörður, in the remote West Fjords of Iceland. He said, I've been watching him on television today, and I just wanted to pass the message. I think maybe he should consider running for president. He was quite good on TV. And I thought, oh, that's kind of funny. So sure, thank you. I'll pass on the message. That's nice of you. And then I go back to doing what I'm doing. And then half an hour later, somebody else calls. And he says, I'm a police officer, and we're on shift today in our group of police in this other town. We saw your husband on television, and we think he should consider running for president. And I'm thinking, funny, Goodney's going to be so surprised when he gets home. And eventually he gets home, and I say, you wouldn't believe how many people have called and saw you on TV today and think that you should run for president. And he said, I would believe it, because he showed me his phone with all these text messages and direct messages and all these people in the course of a day. And Svanhild and Lori, the Icelanders are here, know that this is also not inaccurate. That happened in about 24 to 48 hours, that all of a sudden it went from nothing to people thinking he should run for head of state. And so he did. And he won. That was in June that year. And thus began a wonderful adventure of him serving as president for 8 years, two 4-year terms, which ended last summer. And again, my first book is a little bit based on this idea, but I all of a sudden was thrust on the national stage as somebody's wife. And although I'm extremely, is it not working? A little bit of feedback. Oh, I'm very sorry. I'm also Canadian, I have to apologize. Sorry about that. So sorry. So I was thrust on the stage as somebody's wife, and although I'm very proud to be Goodney's wife, it's not my defining characteristic as a human being. And so it was very interesting to explore what it meant to have the incredible and unique honor to serve as my adopted country's first lady, and also be a feminist, and also be somebody who has my own voice and my own ambition and my own career. And yet I thought, well, Iceland is the closest country in the world to closing the gender gap. If there's anywhere where we can push back against some outdated expectations for female spouses of male heads of state, Iceland is it. And so I worked a lot to do that as First Lady, and one of those projects was writing a book. I'm finally getting to the actual answer of your question. But it is kind of a funny story. And in the pandemic, I wrote this book, Secrets of the Sprakkar, which is all about Iceland's extraordinary women. Sprakkar is an old Icelandic word that means extraordinary women. And after I wrote that book, in Iceland we have this phrase, að ganga með bók í maganum, which means to walk with a book in your belly. And we have this idea and this sentiment that we all have a story that we're waiting to tell. And people used to ask me all the time, what's the book in your belly? And I would say, well, I know it looks like I have 7 books in my belly, but I don't know. I have all these kids, and I run a writer's retreat and lots of projects, and I just don't have time. And I finally found time. I wrote a book, and I thought, if I don't start the next book right away, I'll always say that I don't have time. And that was the birth of Death on the Island. Which was that I wanted a new challenge then, which was to write something fictional. I wanted to write a book that I would enjoy reading. And I enjoy reading murder mysteries, kind of old classic, not really gory, not horror, but just classic, almost sort of British-style mysteries. But obviously I would set it in Iceland. I love Iceland. I feel like I can see it from a different perspective in some senses because I've lived there for over 2 decades, but I wasn't born and raised there. And I could bring out, I hope, some of the things that to me were very special and that I thought an audience abroad would like. And then the book is also an homage, in a sense, to public service and to diplomats. It's actually what I called it was Death of a Diplomat. And that's the British title. And then in North America, it's called Death on the Island. And the premise of the book is, as you mentioned at the beginning, a group of diplomats led by the Canadian ambassador to Iceland. How did I think of that? And his wife. How did I think of that? Who travel on an official visit to the Westman Islands, which is this archipelago off the southern coast of Iceland. And they go on a full day program, which I know many of you will be very familiar with the diplomatic service here, where they're going to open an art exhibition, but they're also trying to increase business ties, but they're also trying to have connections with the local community. And they have a full day program. They go to dinner afterwards to celebrate. They do a toast with a drink called the Flaming Viking, and the deputy ambassador dies. And this happens at the beginning, actually, so I'm not giving you any spoilers. And there's bad weather on the islands, which anyone who's been to Iceland here, oh my gosh. Usually I do something where then I say, oh, you all want to go to Iceland, but you've all been, you're all like, should I do this in Icelandic? Do you speak Icelandic? Wow, that was impressive. Well, they go to this island, and the weather, you can imagine, sometimes does get bad. And so they get trapped on the island, and the wife of the Canadian ambassador needs to figure out what happened. So there is our premise. That was a very long answer.
It's
and because
great
as a woman, I refuse to apologize, but as a Canadian, I feel like I have to apologize for the last answer that took over.
Well, thank you so much for that setup. And let me start right away by asking, what was that like to write fiction as opposed to your previous experience writing nonfiction?
Well, I mean, many of you maybe have journalist connections in this industry too. The nonfiction book that I wrote, in a sense, was the lazy person's answer to writing a book, because I had this experience in journalism where I was used to interviewing people and kind of pulling out stories and news items, and probably a third of the words in that book are other people's words that I'm quoting. And I thought, it'll be easier to write fiction because I don't really need to fact check anything. And if I get into a difficult circumstance, I can just make it up because it's fiction. And for me, at least, it was much harder. I found it much more challenging. It's a bit like, I don't know, trying to jump up and down on a trampoline and it has a net and you know that you're okay. And then fiction's just like, there's nothing there. And I found that more challenging. And, I just told you the story of how I ended up becoming First Lady of Iceland. And if I had written that in a book, someone would have said that's a ridiculous story and unrealistic. But because it actually happened, you can't tell me it's not feasible. But in fiction, you have to be unusual, original, unique, interesting, but realistic, Believable. But it's also about murder. And Iceland is the world's most peaceful country. So the reader has to suspend their disbelief from the outset. But then
this
how
is what's
much?
interesting. So Iceland, you do have this low crime rate, and you have a very high rate of crime writers coming out of Iceland.
I know. We probably
What's up with that?
We're also, so in Iceland, we have a small population. We're almost 400,000 people right now. And we have, I think, the most per capita statistics that you can get, because we love per capita statistics. And so one of those is crime fiction writers per capita. I do like to add, more when I'm speaking in the context of gender equality and other debates, that we have most books written per capita, book publishing rates, probably crime fiction authors. But in the real terms, we have some wonderful statistics where we're not per capita and we still do well, like gender equality, like peacefulness, happiness, life expectancy, welcomingness to the queer community, and a lot of these indices that I think are pretty important for societies. So it's not a bad place to be.
I want to definitely get back to gender equality because I'm curious what takeaways there might be for those of us here in the States. But I want to speak to a praise line that you have from Louise Penny, and just a comment on believability in fiction writers. Your stuff is brilliant. It really, and I have not even read the whole book. But I was taken right away with the depth of the characters, the plot, and it's very Louise Penny-esque what you write, a fellow Canadian. Yeah. And so I have to laugh when you talk about the idea that, writing fiction, it's so freeing for a journalist. Like, you could just kind of make stuff up, but there has to be a realistic premise to it. And so kudos to you. And I just want to mention, in terms of the Canadian tie-in, you do have, is it the Canadian flag on your nails?
It is the Canadian flag on my nails.
For those at home, just if we could have the camera zoom in.
Elbows up, Canada. Yeah. Well, I don't know here in Washington, D.C., if people follow what goes on in politics very much. But in Canada, we have been lately. And I am a proud Canadian, and I am a proud Icelander. And fortunately, these two nations rarely compete in sports. So I don't necessarily have to pick sides, but sometimes I feel the pendulum of my patriotism swings a little bit back and forth. And lately, I feel like it's swung a little bit more to the Canada side. And so I felt that when I was traveling in this lovely country of yours, that I ought to showcase a little bit my loyalties.
Understood. And thank you for that.
And to speak up about the importance of using our voices to change the world and not to stay silent.
Thank you for that. I think an idea that we can all rally around, gender equality. It is remarkable, the leadership in Iceland. And I'm curious, are there takeaways, systemic takeaways that we might be able to pull from that country?
So, yeah, I mean, I could do a whole talk on this aspect as well, and maybe I'll vaguely try to tie it back to the murder mystery, or at least to say in the murder mystery that there are strong female characters, I think, who, and I really played with the idea of sometimes how women are underestimated, or that they are put into boxes based on the roles that other people perceive they have. But in terms of gender equality, as you said, Iceland is the closest in the world to closing the gender gap. And yes, we have a number of policies, government-led policies, that help to speed up that process, such as paid parental leave for both parents, heavily subsidized childcare. There are other things to do with laws proving equal pay for equal work, laws concerning the boards of publicly traded companies, et cetera, et cetera. And it's one thing to say, well, in these countries that helps to speed up the process, and I think it sends the message to know that working towards greater equality is a decision that you make. It is something that can take a backlash if we don't continue to be vigilant about it. And it's something that we recognize in Iceland is going to benefit people of all genders and is not a zero-sum game where you're taking something from one group at the expense of another. Having said all that, I find that some of the challenges that when we talk to people and you say, well, I live somewhere that doesn't have guaranteed parental leave, or I have somewhere that doesn't necessarily guarantee these rights, it's hard for us to feel as individuals that we can do something. And one of the things that I tried to do in Secrets of the Spraker was profile the stories of regular people to give us, I hope, all inspiration about the importance of using our voices. And that includes, of course, we should be advocating with the people who are policymakers and decision makers and budget holders to do all these things. But let's assume that we are a few degrees away from that. As individuals, I think it comes down to recognizing it as something that is a benefit to people of all genders, not for one gender. It comes down to recognizing that it's not going to happen of its own accord, or certainly not fast enough, and that we are facing a global backlash against gender equality, including in Iceland. And thirdly, that there are small ways in which we can all make a difference. And that is encouraging all of us to use our voices. It's thinking about how we're creating committees and teams, and what we're consuming, whether we're reading books written by women, whether we're following sports teams, female sports teams, and listening to music, and all of the ways that we consume and live our lives. And I think that that is something really important, and not just for gender equality, but diversity overall, to try to remember that we need to hear different voices, and that is incredibly important, and that we need to, those of us who are in privileged positions need to remember to hand the mic to other people who maybe don't have that opportunity, and to make sure that we can lift up each other's voices.
Thank you.
Actually, when you say that, I've totally gone off from the murder mystery, but the murder mystery has strong women. Okay, two other things. Because I think this is important, and you brought it up. Two other things. I'll tell you one story about women in Iceland. This year, we're celebrating the Women's Year in Iceland. It's a big year globally, as you know, anniversary, say, of the 1995 speech in Beijing, where women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. And in Iceland, it's the 50th anniversary of the day that women took the day off, which in a nutshell was when 90% of the country's women refused to work for the day, both at home and in the office, and the country predictably shut down. And that really galvanized a whole nation into knowing that when we work together, and this was a peaceful and joyful celebration, when we work together, we can really affect change. And secondly, is a teeny tiny little story about my mom on the farm in Canada, where I grew up, who has always worked from home. And when I was a kid, I used to say, oh, my dad's a teacher and my mom doesn't work. And then as I got older, I was like, oh, she works. I've discovered she had unpaid work at home. And after the pandemic, my mom's almost 80. She's not a political person. She's not an activist. And she says, well, what I try to do every day, I try to make someone's day a little bit better and make sure that I've done something every single day that has made somebody else's day better, whether that is calling someone I don't know about them, baking pies for the church bazaar, or bringing, going out for lunch with her new friend from yoga class, or whatever it is. And I thought, imagine if every single day, all of us did one little thing that brightened somebody else's day, what an impact that would have.
It would be amazing.
So we can all do things.
I wanted to, about the book, Jane is quite the sleuth. How much of you is in Jane?
So this is a good question. My heroine, for lack of a better term, in the book is a woman called Jane Shearer. She is the wife of the Canadian ambassador, and I wanted to explore this idea of how we sometimes box people in to these stereotypes before we get to know them. And I actually called her Jane. It's a bit of an homage to Jane Marple, because this is sort of this Agatha Christie style book, but also because I tried to pick a very kind of generic sounding name that, with due respect to people, called Jane. Then I remembered that my middle name was Jean, and I thought, oh, people are going to think I'm just adapted it, but that's not the case. And after I wrote the first draft of the book, and I sent it to my agent, she said, oh, I really like it. I like the characters and how it's developing, but the character Jane, she's very two-dimensional right now, and I don't really have a sense of who she is. And to refer back to Louise Penny, who you mentioned, I think one of the things that I hope people like about a series in her novel is that you get invested in those characters. You have fun with the actual murder mystery, but you also get to know the people and feel invested in the people. And my agent said, well, Jane, not that much. And I realized that I think I was very worried that people would think that she was me. Exactly, because I have been the wife of a well-known person, and I'm from Canada, and I live in Iceland, and I thought, oh, if I give her, I didn't want to write a character that had these tropes of she's so much, more capable than she realizes she is, or like some cheap cliche. But I thought if I give her all these flaws, people will think that that's what I'm worried about with myself. And then also, this is the wonderful thing about proudly entering middle age. I just realized, I don't really care what other people think. I don't have to care what other people think. Doesn't matter. And so then I just thought, you know what? I know who she is. I know I've made her up, and I'm going to make her a fun and interesting and flawed and smart and talented character. And if people want to attribute some of that to me or not, that's completely fine. So I kind of lent into that. And I would say that she's quite smart, but she's also a little bit she's tired of things. She married this spouse who's an ambassador, who is kind of not a bad guy, but sort of a mediocre ambassador whose career is kind of plateaued. And she realizes now that she met this guy very young, and she's been kind of following him around the whole world all the time, changing her life for him, and not really having a chance to pursue her own interests that he doesn't particularly support. And not even to the degree that it's made him incredibly successful or happy. And so she's at this dinner, and she's just a bit tired of it all. And she's tired of the kind of two-facedness of things. And I loved these diplomatic dinners. One, I love eating, so there was always really good food at them. But also, I love meeting new people. I love having dialogues. I like actually mingling, which is weird, I know, and meeting people and talking to people. And so she's sort of tired of all of that, even though she understands that it has to be done. And I thought that that's something that the reader can maybe relate to, because even if people aren't diplomats themselves, we've all had those days where we have to go to work and we have to accomplish X objective, and we really just don't feel like it at all. And so she's a little bit in that place.
One of the other characters is a novelist, and there's a lot of talk about, is there going to be a sequel? Yeah. So that leads me to ask you, will there be a sequel?
Yeah, and the novelist too is a Canadian from the town of Gimli, Manitoba, and that's a little bit of an Easter egg to Canadians, because Gimli, Manitoba is a population of about 4,000 people. It's near Winnipeg, and it's the site of New Iceland, where many Icelanders left in the late 19th century, and there's a big Viking statue there, and so that's not relevant to the plot, but anybody who kind of knows that there's this descent. So, excuse me, yes, there is a sequel coming. I'm 54,117 words into it, or thereabouts. So no, it's been really fun. I wrote this book. I sold it. It's a two-book deal, I should say. And so I'm writing this one. Excuse me. And I'm also finishing up. I've bizarrely decided to write 2 books in 1 year. So I'm also finishing up actually a memoir of my time as First Lady.
Oh, wow.
And that is really about an ordinary woman who ended up in an extraordinary position. And the honor of that and how I tried to make the most of that unexpected opportunity. So that'll come out in May. And then probably the second mystery, depending what the publishers want, maybe in the fall or something. And then it just got optioned for TV as well, the murder mystery. So it's pretty fun. My kids are much more excited about that than that I wrote a book.
Absolutely. Now, who will play Jane? Oh, thank you so much. Oh my gosh.
Thank you. It's right here, but I didn't want to stop
thank you.
talks on it. See, in Iceland, we all help each other out too.
Yes. That's servant leadership right there.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. Impressive. Wanted to ask about is there any feeling of a loss of control a little bit? I mean, it's obviously exciting, the TV piece, but also just the larger. Is there any kind of like, oh my gosh, this thing is out of my control?
With the book?
Yeah.
Not yet. I mean, I kind of almost, that means it's like a massive success, which would be kind of interesting to experience. I don't feel it's that much of a, I mean, I'm not viral as do the kids say viral? Is that what they say? I don't know. I mean, my mom would say like, I watched this, I sent it to 40 of my friends and it's going to go viral. And I'm like, I feel like that's not the level of viral anymore. But, it's kind of like my philosophy for life. You do your best, you be nice, you be honest, and then see what happens. And so much in life is luck. And so with the book, so far, I mean, knock on wood, it's been well received. I've done my very best. And that's all we can really ask for. And then so much of it is luck. What the zeitgeist is feeling or what they're not feeling or what they want to do. And I feel that I've been I feel I've been incredibly lucky anyway with my life and the people in my life, and so that's wonderful. We'll just see what happens. And I guess the one thing that I've always tried to do is to make the most of those chances, because I think when things happen, when I became this from zero to my husband winning a presidential election in 7 weeks. That's a positive change, and that's an exciting change, and it's an honor, and it's a privilege, and it's also really, really scary. And so there's kind of a point of kind of trying to lean into that uncomfortable fear in order to really make the most, because that chance is never going to come around again. And if there's one thing that I've wanted to think, it's that I don't want to feel like I didn't take hold of that opportunity with all my might.
Are there any regrets that you have now that the book is out? Do you ever think, oh gosh, one thing?
I haven't reread it, so it's actually a plus. Like, you don't really read. I'm not going to read from the book. Like, I'll just read from the last 2 pages of my murder mystery. So I haven't really read it out loud. And anybody knows who's written a book. I finished it a year ago, right, or just over a year ago. And then you read maybe the proofs. So I did a book event a couple weeks ago. And the person interviewing me obviously just read it, and he had a lot of questions. He said, why did you choose this and the plot? Not publicly, but just beforehand. They were very detailed about plot twists. And I had forgotten some of the things, And I said, oh yeah, no, you're right. I did do that. No, I can't remember why, because I'd even forgotten that it had happened.
Evil genius plan the whole time.
Yeah. So my husband has also written a number of books. He's written a lot of academic books. And when he gets the new first edition, he actually goes through it to see if there's any typos or mistakes. Like, he rereads it right away. Whereas I get it and I never read it again, because I figure, I probably will look and think, oh, this is awful. Or how could I have been hired to write this and they're going to cancel my next contracts? And I just don't want to think about it. So I just, you feel like writing a book. I feel like I've put on a bikini and I've stood out there and said, okay, everybody, what do you think? It's sort of that intimidating. But, that's, again, just got to go for it.
What do you miss most about Iceland since you've been away?
Well, I live still in Iceland, and I do travel a lot. The swimming pools are great. We have wonderful swimming pools in Iceland, and they're really good places to relax and also to bring family and to go with kids. You know, I have teenagers now, and it may shock you to know that they don't always want to hang out with their parents. But they'll go to the swimming pool with us, and that's kind of a nice thing. And the water in Iceland is great.
Will they let you speak with them or no?
It depends on the kid.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Sometimes it's like, I'll meet you there like later, or I'll go afterwards. Or if they're with their friends, especially, and they've gone earlier, and I have one who's 13 turning 14, if he's gone with his friends and we happen to be there, it's like you can't acknowledge that he exists, you know. And I think one time we were at IKEA, and he was with his friends. IKEA is the best sort of go-to lunch spot in Iceland because it's really cheap lunch in the cafeteria. And he was with his friends. You know, they take the bus there to hang out at IKEA because the lunch is cheap and you can get ice cream cones. And I happened to go, and he was walking by with his friends. I'm like, hey, over there. And the look he gave me was just like, do not acknowledge that I am your son. Yeah.
It's almost going to be another murder that you have to write about.
He was not happy with that at all.
Let me just take a quick pause and ask if we have any questions that have gone to Cecily. Do we have any cards filled out yet?
I'm walking around.
Okay, if anybody has any cards, any questions that they'd like asked, if you want to just pass your cards on down.
Oh, very organized. Yeah.
Leaving nothing.
I have a question. It's not a question. It's a comment for all of you while you're thinking of your questions. And that is that this is my first event that has a Viking, not a flaming Viking. I guess we'll just call it a Viking. So I'm very curious to know what you think of it for those of you who try it at the end. Because it's a fabricated drink.
Did anybody try the Viking drink? Actually, maybe you could describe how you came about.
I mean, it's pretty critical to the plot at the beginning of the book, and there's this whole performance that's done at this dinner to show off for tourists, and I called it the Flaming Viking because it's a very touristy kind of name. And I wrote it a little bit generically, like I did in my first draft. I didn't explain it very well. And then I know someone in Iceland who's a mixologist who said, well, if you need a cocktail, I'll actually create a cocktail for you. And so we had a cocktail tasting evening to try a bunch of different variations. It was very difficult. It's hard to be a writer. It's tough to try the right one. And then I, just said what it needed plot-wise. So it's kind of fun to see that happen.
Sounds good.
I said like people are standing up to go to the bar right now.
Yeah, that's it.
But I did see this version also has Canadian maple syrup, so thanks for that.
I think that there were some rules about lighting fires inside this building, so we had to kind of just bring it down just a little bit. It's authentic except for the flaming part.
And then, that's the great thing about fiction, right? Maybe they're not even allowed to do that in the restaurant, but it's fiction, so I could say that.
There we go.
I have a question that I can just ask.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll repeat.
I couldn't find a pen. Bad journalist. So about the structure of your book. So it kind of goes back in time, and it's sort of a tick-tock.
Okay.
How did you decide on that structure?
So the question was that the book has a kind of countdown clock starting quite close to the beginning, and how I decided on that. And the book begins, again, I'm not really giving you any spoilers. There's a 2-page prologue, which is meant to just sort of whet your appetite. And then it basically starts at this dinner where we meet all the characters in one. So it's maybe a bit of a dose of characters, and then you don't really need to meet anybody else. And at the end of the dinner, there's a toast, and the deputy ambassador dies. And when I wrote my first draft of the book, it didn't start that way. The first draft of the book started with them, this group of dignitaries traveling to the island for their visit that day. And then on the boat going over throughout the day, all their visits, and then it culminated in this dinner where someone died. And my very lovely editor, the woman who acquired it for Canada is Nita Prose, who's written this book, The Maid, that has done very well lately, this series. So she's no longer an editor. But Nita, who is wonderful, was reading the first draft, and she said this very diplomatically. She said, well, nobody dies until page 85, and no one is going to be bothered to read that far. Because I guess we all have shorter attention spans, and I'm not an established author. And she said, people don't want to read to page 85 before there's a body. And she suggested, which I think was that's why we have editors, to start maybe at the dinner, in the moment. And I think as a as a first-time fiction writer as well, I had a tendency, as people say, to kind of write into the characters, that the first time you bring up a character, you give their whole backstory so that you know who this person is. And you're writing like 3 pages of the whole person's history. And again, my editor's like, you don't need to do that. That can come out gradually. So I started it at this dinner. And then I realized that the tension kind of deflated because... the person dies and then you go back to earlier in the day. And so the countdown clock, I don't know how I got the idea, and I assume that I can't be the first person on planet Earth who's had this idea, but I thought if I have a clock, you turn the page and it says 13 hours before she died. And then you get to the next chapters and then it's 11 hours before she died, etc. And there's even more of a twist on it later, that it keeps you kind of turning the pages a little bit. So that's why I thought of it, just as a way to keep the suspense up.
The book is set in the Westman Islands. What are the islands really like?
Ooh, good question. So the Westman Islands, which are known in Icelandic as Vestmannaeyjar, and so I actually use that term in the book itself. They are this archipelago that people have lived there really since around the time of the settlement, and I hope that I've described them in an evocative way in the book itself, because they are beautiful. They're one of my favorite parts of the island, just because they have been so isolated. So you can fly. It can be bad for the weather. You have to take a ferry. There's no obviously bridge or tunnel or anything like that. So it has always developed its own character in some sense and has this long history. And they're gorgeous. They have these beautiful, grass-topped mountains everywhere. They have puffins. If you like to go to see puffins in Iceland, that's the place that you go. They have a beluga whale sanctuary. There was a volcanic eruption there in the 70s, and they've built a new museum there that's around the house that they excavated from some ash. So there's a lot of history there. One of the best swimming pools in Iceland, too. So in the book, some of the things, there's a swimming pool that's real. The hotel that I have a lot of at is made up. There's a restaurant. Obviously, the restaurant scene is based on a real restaurant with a different name. And if anybody likes the sound of this restaurant, it's closing after this summer, so you have to go this summer.
Oh, wow.
And then the folklore museum that is in the book as well is not exactly the same, but based on a similar folklore museum, and some of the exhibits are also the same.
Do you see this as being a tourist draw?
Sorry, the islands?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they are for sure, but they're maybe not one that most people see, just because it is that extra step farther to get to. But it's one of my favorite places to visit.
What was the biggest culture shock when you first arrived in Iceland?
Probably the darkness in the winter. I guess that's not a culture shock, really, is it? But it's just south of the Arctic Circle, so that means that at this time of year, it doesn't get dark at all. But in December, it doesn't get light until almost 11 in the morning. So the winter darkness, that you're basically getting up in the dark for 6 or 7 months of the year. And that can be trying sometimes. Cultural differences. And then you just adapt. I hesitate to make broad generalizations, but I would say some of the things that I really like about Iceland is that it's very egalitarian. As you know, we're all on a first name basis. There isn't a lot of kind of social hierarchies, certainly based on, say, your name or your accent or where you went to school or something like that. So it's very egalitarian in that sense, which is, I think, kind of broadly Nordic. Quite informal, which I would also recognize sort of from Canada. Much more fashionable in Canada, though, I have to say. And but also, it's a small society, so everybody knows each other. So I said it's a little bit like starting to watch, The Bold and the Beautiful, and you can follow the new characters from where you start, but you don't know any of the backstory, right? So you don't know that anything that has happened to any of them before, which everybody else seems to know, which is a plus and a minus side, I guess. So, like everything, there's good things and more challenging things, but certainly I've really loved living there and raising my family there.
Can you talk about the power of storytelling for ordinary women? What matters most?
That's a great question. Good questions, Guy. That's what happens when you're with journalists, isn't it? In this group. The power. So, that's one of the things that I like to talk about overall, and that's kind of the message that I had from writing Secrets of the Sprakkar, and almost in telling my own nonfiction story, is like that phrase that I said, that to walk with a book in your belly, that we all have a story to tell. And somehow I think that storytelling, especially fiction, somehow enables us to teach really important lessons in a softer way. Like, it's an easier way sometimes to swallow bitter pills, which help to teach us about important things, but it also helps us to connect to each other. So often now we are being fed the differences between all of us and the ways in which we're unlike each other. And I think that we're all members of the human race. We all want safety, happiness, security, food, shelter, and some of us take that more for granted than others. But I think that storytelling can be a means to explain how, say, if you're a farmer next to a volcano in a remote part of Iceland, you might still be able to relate to the business person who's in Washington, D.C. And that to me is important and powerful. And it's a unique quality of the human species, is that we're all storytellers in some way. And I think you said, how do we tell our stories for women? What was the second part of the question?
I shuffled it in here now.
Well, I would just meant, in the context of how I'm always thinking about gender equality, women in some senses, I feel, in families and ours are the keepers of the stories. I don't want to generalize too much, but often the people who know all the stories about cousin so-and-so or such and such in law or your great-great-grandparents or what they did in all of those stories. And yet also not the ones whose stories get recorded as much. We lose fewer stories of women. And I think just overall we need to increase the diversity of the stories we tell so we have different perspectives on everything that's happened. I studied history again, and history has so much to do with perspective and what gets actually written down and recorded. And I always think it's great for people in their everyday lives to just, record what's going on in their lives. That's really important.
You hit on it. It was what matters most, and that is great. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for these questions. Are outstanding. Who was the person who most influenced you?
Writing the book, or I guess you don't know the details.
We just, yeah.
We don't know the details. Who is the person who most influenced me?
Thank you.
Well, I would say, growing up, my family, that's the closest people to me. And I grew up in a very storytelling family. My father is an English professor. And so, when we were choosing English projects in school, he'd read all of the books that you could choose from for things. And he could tell you, I remember doing The Old Man and the Sea for a project because it was the shortest book. And even though I got lectures in all of the talks, and my mother is just a brilliant storyteller. And she would just, when we were kids, we'd always say, "Oh, Mom, tell the story about when you forgot to bring your sandwich to school, or when you accidentally put your top on backwards." We would have these favorite stories, and on a Saturday night, we'd ask her to tell these stories. And I think it was only as an adult when I realized it wasn't really even a story. It was just one day she went to school and she forgot to bring her lunch. That's how someone who can't tell a story would tell that story. And yet we thought it was fascinating and it was funny, and we wondered what was going to happen next. And there was a denouement, and there was a hero, and she's just a brilliant storyteller about all these things. And so we grew up hearing all these kinds of stories. And, I think from the gender equality perspective as well, I have no cousins. All my parents' siblings didn't have kids. And for me, that showed I have these aunts who've never been married, never had kids, and what great role models they were, because I never grew up thinking I have to get married and have children, and that's a key to some kind of societal definition of success. And I really liked having those strong female role models. My grandmother was a nursing sister in the Second World War. Canada was the only country that sent women to the front lines. And, she slept next to a landmine and had all these stories, which, again, are really important, I think, stories to share. And then, I think we can all learn from each other all the time. So, I'm trying to think of famous people or not. I read a lot of Agatha Christie, this is sort of Christie-style book. But I try to read a lot, both murder mysteries, current affairs, politics, all kinds of stuff. And we just sort of through osmosis absorb a lot of that information and style.
When did you learn to speak? Do you say Icelandic?
Icelandic, yeah.
Oh, okay. Icelandic. When did you learn when did you learn it, and when did you speak it, and how did that affect your ability to be effective as First Lady?
So nobody really moves to Iceland speaking Icelandic already, I would say. It's not a kind of language that you learn. But when I lived in England and I was dating Goodney, I had a CD-ROM. That shows you how old I am. And the CD-ROM taught me phrases like, where is the train station? And there are no trains in Iceland. And where is the beach? Also not help. It was like some tourist one they did in a bunch of languages. And I really mastered how to say, someone has stolen my passport, which again, you don't need to use very much. So once I moved to Iceland and I knew I was going to be really settling there in the long term, I started to take Icelandic lessons and I tried to speak a lot. And I've made so many mistakes that I would have to have 7 Flaming Vikings to tell you all of those mistakes that I've made. But I've made a lot of mistakes. You have to feel comfortable doing it. And then different phases in your life kind of help you, So when my husband ran for president, I learned words like referenda and candidate and constitutional, amendment and these things that I didn't know. When my kids started preschool, I learned words like snot and dinosaur because you say those words a lot if you have preschoolers, but you don't really say them otherwise in conversation. So, it comes in fits and starts, and it's always a learning process for me. But I do speak pretty good Icelandic. And I think had I not spoken good Icelandic, it would have been detrimental when my husband ran for president, because I tried to speak at all events and introduce him. And if I couldn't speak the language, I think that may not have been ideal. And when I served as First Lady, I tried to speak and do a lot of speeches and events a lot, not just because I think that women shouldn't be silent props to their husbands, but also because I speak Icelandic imperfectly and with an accent. And it's important to showcase that just because you speak it imperfectly doesn't mean you don't have something to say.
That's great. Okay, we're running kind of short on time, but I want to try to get these quickly to you. You run a writer's retreat. What's the idea behind that?
Yeah, so laughs my co-founder. Was that you? No. That's a plant question. So I do run an event with Erica Jacobs-Green and Sue Urbeck here as our general manager, so you can approach either of them if you have questions. It's called, we founded it, and Erica, I'm going to tell my version of the story because I'm the one on stage right now. In 2013, Eric and I were having glasses of wine one night, and she's also a writer and editor. We worked in this field, and we were talking about, Eric had come back from a conference and had a great time, and talking about how much fun it was, and that we didn't know of anything in Iceland, in Reykjavik, which is a UNESCO City of Literature, for people who love to write, even though Iceland has this wonderful literary heritage and this proud support of writers. And emboldened by the wine, I said, well, I think that's a brilliant idea. We should just do this ourselves. And so we did. And we just started to meet and have lunches, and we planned this event. And effectively, it's something we run every year in April for anybody who likes to write. Whether you work as a full-time writer, whether you work as a journalist, whether you are working on a diary, anything you want at any level. I know there's also people who have attended before, so they can hopefully speak up for it. And the idea is that anyone can go, you attend small group workshops with well-known authors from around the world who teach classes on editing and character building and whatever. It's different every year. And then we also introduce people to Iceland's literary heritage. And we have tours that are led by writers, including my husband, now that he is no longer busy running the country. Yeah. So he was our tour guide again this year. He was our first year's because he came cheap. And we have a pub night with local music and authors. And so it's something that we really have a lot of fun doing.
Okay, this is a really quick one. How long did it take you to write your book, start to finish?
Okay. 9 months for Secrets of the Sprecher, and then probably 2 years and a bit for this one, because I started right away, and you have to write the whole darn book before you can try to sell it. And then it's hard to be motivated. So in fits and starts, 2 years.
And the general writing process, was it?
Sit at a computer,
And
open
do
Word.
The thing. Yeah.
Play Sudoku, put the laundry on, get a coffee, write 2 sentences, take food out of the dishwasher, write 2 more sentences. I just try to, if I'm writing that day, and I don't write every day, I think, okay, I'm going to write like at least a chapter or 1,000 words or something. And basically, depending on how much Sudoku I play, that can take anywhere from 1 hour to 4 hours, and then I work the rest of the time.
Okay, we have one last question, but before I ask that final question, I need to take a moment to thank all of the organizers for today's event. Our headliners leader, Jen Judson, today's headliner event organizer, Donna Lewan-Leger, and our wonderful National Press Club Executive Director, Didier, staff liaison, Cecily Scott-Martin. We also have a board member here, Poonam, if you could raise your hand. And thank you so much to all of the people who came here. If you want to learn any more about upcoming events at the Press Club, please visit our website, www.press.org. And now it is my distinct pleasure, get those cameras ready, to present you, Eliza, with the coveted National Press Club mug from DC.
Wow, thank you.
Good deal. And this last one, the last question, is actually a request from embassy staff. Wow, can you ask again how many people have been to Iceland so I can take a pic?
That's Austis, isn't it? And she's there. Everybody put up your hand if you've been to Iceland, and put up your hand if you want to go to Iceland and haven't been yet. That's awesome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the amazing questions, and thank you, Eliza.
Thank you all. That was fun. Okay. And I do have, I'm going to sign some books, I think.
Oh, that's good, yes.
Yes. So if you bought a book, I'll sign it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.